our goal was to bring awareness and education to the topic of accessibility. In that process, I learned more about myself and my own neurodivergence. I am dyslexic and ADHD, and I got to learn this during my, my discovery into the world of accessibility. And I realized soon afterwards I needed that to be my sole focus of my job. And that's when I started looking elsewhere and found my place at Panorama. I do want to throw a disclaimer out there real quick. I often use identity first language, and what that means is I identify as a neurodivergent individual, not as a person with neurodivergence. I just wanted to throw this out here just to know, just that you all know that the reason why I do this comes from a place of disability pride. I'm proud of my disability. I think it makes me a really thoughtful and empathetic designer. And I'd like to be a disability advocate. But I do realize that there are people who don't have the same lived in experiences as myself. And for some, that is triggering. And for others, one way is triggering versus another. So I did want to at least make note of that. I have this wonderful quote here about how each person does have their own experience with that. But my hope is just to be authentic to myself. Sometimes I may switch back and forth between person first and identity first, just depending on what I'm talking about, but I wanted to at least make note of that. First, second, so, all right. So what is accessibility? It is oftentimes abbreviated as A11Y, and I just want to note that when you see that, it is because accessibility is a really hard word to spell out, especially for somebody who's dyslexic. So it's just easier to abbreviate this way. But accessibility is removing those barriers that are created for an able-bodied world, so that people with disabilities are able to access resources and technologies. And there are different types of disabilities. And not all of them are visible. So there are visual disabilities, hearing disabilities, physical and cognitive. Thinking of the world of EdTech, this could be the teacher whose eyesight is deteriorating with age, or maybe it's the teacher who went to too many rock concerts as a kid and doesn't hear as well as they used to. Maybe it's the student whose arm is in the sling, or who has epilepsy, or maybe it's the autistic student. So there's many different variations of disabilities that are out there, and not all of them are going to be visible, and one person can have many different types. This could also be the teacher who has PTSD. So just want to make note that all disabilities are not necessarily visible. And with that, I also want to talk about the fact that they're not all, I like to think of disabilities as being temporarily abled, or rather the world is temporarily abled. This particular infographic is one of my favorites. At the time when I saw it, it was when I had returned from maternity leave. This was the beginning of the pandemic, when all daycares were closed, and I was a full-time working mom with both of my children, and one of them was a newborn. And I would often be holding him in my arms as I was working and studying about accessibility. And I just happened to come across this graphic as he was sleeping in my arms and I was working on my laptop. And what I particularly love about this is that it talks about how disabilities are permanent, or can be permanent, but they can also be temporary and situational. And we all experience situational disabilities at different various points within our lives. And so just coming at it from that lens, you start to realize how all people can really benefit from accessibility. So in this graphic, particularly the one that I was referring to is on this first top line here, which is for touch. And you'll see that situational is that new parent with a baby in the arms. Temporary was going to be if you have an arm injury, maybe it's in a sling, and then permanent if somebody has one arm. But when we create technologies that are helpful to people with disabilities, it does impact everyone in a positive way. And we define how we do this by the WCAG, and the WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They're published to help us to identify if we are making our products accessible. Now, they are not perfect and they are just guidelines, but they do help us to all come together to a certain standard that we should be applying to. Most often, you'll see that companies are AA compliant. That is what is referred to most likely. But the lowest level is A compliance, and then the highest is AAA. And if empathy isn't enough to make you understand the importance of accessibility, there's also a huge legal impact for not being accessible. When you exclude people from your product because it's not accessible, you are liable to get sued. And the pandemic did not slow that down whatsoever. In 2020, there was 3,550 cases, and that's a 23% rise overall in lawsuits for accessibility. And even if you get sued once, it does not stop you from getting sued again. So it's very important that you make steps to remediate your websites. Sorry, brain fog. And so here at Panorama, we value every student. And so, but unfortunately, at least at this time, they realized that because the products were not accessible, they were not making the products available to every student. Now, Panorama did have a client who recognized and needed their product to be accessible. And there were a few passionate individuals at Panorama who advocated on behalf of accessibility beyond just the fact that one client needed this. And the leadership listened, which is amazing. And they supported the efforts and realized that this was something that they wanted to continue doing and not just do as a one-time fix, but this was something that they wanted to value at Panorama and continue to work on. So they started an accessibility task team, and that's when I started. So our team today has one engineering manager, 6 engineers, 1 product manager, and 1 designer. That's me. And I do want to note too that leadership buy-in is extremely crucial. I know from experience, it can't be a team of 1. And when you are trying to advocate on behalf of accessibility by yourself, it's very easy to quickly burn out. And so we started small. As I had mentioned, this was for one particular product that we were working on. It was our public facing product that we needed to make AA compliant. And so we were able to take that time to really just focus in on those individual pages. But some other ways that we prioritize the way that we focus on accessibility and what we are going to update is by severity. So how is this action, are we blocking people from performing an action based on the inaccessibility of this particular feature? Or by effort, how long is this going to take versus is this quick fix? An occurrence, is this something that is available on the template and so then therefore is repeated on every page? Or is this just a unique individual situation? Sorry, that's my doorbell. And so one of the things that I did personally was evaluate the design system. 60% of accessibility issues can be solved by the design alone. Sorry. Hopefully they don't need me.
It always happens, right? When you're giving a presentation. I think all of us understand. It's okay.
We're just
whatever you need to do. I can take it for a minute if you need that, if you're okay.
Let's see, hold on.
While she's checking that, I put a link to the slides and to our board. So those of you that are new coming in, the slides are available. You can leave kind of comments, like stickies for comments and questions around the slides, or you can talk in the chat. Either way, just as a heads up. Yeah, normal Zoom life.
Yeah.
For sure.
Neighbor boy looking for my daughter.
Okay.
I'll be fine. So yes, the accessibility design, or the design system, and most important is having that original foundation to make sure that you're creating with the right building blocks as you're working on your layouts and your new pages. So that consists of everything between the color palette itself, the fonts and heading styles that you associate it with, and all of your form elements and components, specifically making sure that they include labels. So a little bit about what we did within that time period. First, our color palette was not very accessible. It was something that I was able to quickly identify since starting here. So we made efforts to correct where we could, and it was beyond even just the charts and our text styles, but then it was also, sorry, I got distracted again. Anyway, the example that I have on screen here is particularly for a chart. And so this particular chart, we do have some colorblind employees at our office who were able to recognize that the color combination that we were using in our charts, which was the red-green color combination, was very difficult for them to be able to identify what the different sections were in the chart. So one of the things that we took a look at was how can we update this to be more accessible? Because as you can see on the chart, this chart to the left here, even though they had created colorblind friendly colors, it still wasn't meeting color contrast. There is actually, in fact, here a number, which I'm sure you cannot see because it is a very light gray with white text on top of it. So taking a look at all of our color palettes, how can we update this so that we're meeting the proper color contrast, but then also doing one better, and we're not relying on color alone to convey information. And so for this particular chart, we wanted to update the colors to be a little bit easier on for people who were colorblind and using an orange to blue color combination. And then also played around with the idea of including iconography within the charts itself too. Because even just not just for colorblind people, but imagine printing out this chart on in black and white printer. And so you'll lose all of the context of what this chart actually means the minute that you print it out. So again, considering the fact that accessibility really does benefit all people. Text was another focus, as I had mentioned earlier. So we evaluated our heading styles and fonts for consistency and legibility. There was a page that had a lot of blue italicized text. Now, somebody who's dyslexic like myself, it's very difficult to read a whole block of text that's in italics. So taking a look at everything and really being thoughtful about the choices that we were making, and then also really paying attention to the heading structure of each of the pages. So every page should have a single H1 element on it, and that should be enough to have it should, what's the word I'm looking for? It should portray what the actual page that you're going to and the meaning on that page. You should know what that page is by looking at that H1. And then every heading style below that should follow in descending order. So one of the things that we did was really evaluate each and every single one of the pages in our product to make sure that the heading styles made sense from a hierarchy standpoint, both in semantics, so our H1, H2, and then also visually too, making sure that a visual style for H2 made sense. And also our layout. It's important that layouts use simple, straightforward, and consistent layouts, and that the reading order should make logical sense. Now, this is very important for people who use screen readers because that's the way that they view the pages as they are, as each element is being read out loud. And so if the order does not match the way that you are visually looking at it, there is a discrepancy there. And so you want to make sure that the visual order matches up to the reading order, which is very important. So in my example here, I have the reading order going from the top left down below, then back up to the top right, and then below again. And so ideally you would have each of these go to the, you want to go in the same way that you would read an item, right? So if this is English, you go from left to right. So it should be that it goes for all of the items at the top, then down to the bottom, going from left to right. And links versus buttons, this is a debate that we still talk about on a daily basis. First, it's very important that all of your links are meaningful and unique. Again, talking about screen readers, if I were to look at a page utilizing a screen reader, one of the ways that a screen reader user might navigate through a page is just by looking at the links alone. So if you're pulling up a list of all of the links that are located on a particular page and they all say view all, that doesn't give me enough information to know what that means. View all of what, and what's the difference between the first view all link and the second view all link. There's not enough information. So it's really important that each and every link has its own distinct name. And then not only that, but that we're using them in the way that makes sense. So a phrase that we use often is that a button should be a button. Now this applies to semantics alone, or semantics itself, where we should be using HTML5 elements to determine what buttons are and what links are, and not, let's say, a div with a lot of JavaScript that says this should be a button. Again, this is very important for assistive technologies because they won't recognize that an item is a button if it is not using the proper semantics. But from a design perspective too, also making sure that it is, you are using the right element depending on what it is. So when to use a button, when it's an action that you're performing. When to use a link, when you are navigating to a certain page or destination. So it can even just be an area on the page. And so we make sure that not only does the semantics match, but then also the design matches as well. The example that I have here, back to that colorblind friendly chart, in order to activate those colorblind friendly colors, we had buttons along the top, and we also had another button that would hide the values on the chart. So we had a lot of discussions about what should this be, because at first we were talking about the color contrast and that wasn't proper. So we wanted to update that. But the more that we discussed the element, the more that we realized that maybe it shouldn't be a button to begin with. So then my engineers took a look at the code and determined that it was actually coded to be a checkbox. So then we discussed the purpose of a checkbox. Now, a checkbox usually has some sort of an apply button, and it doesn't take immediate action. So the more that we discussed it, the more that we realized this really makes more sense to be a toggle switch, because the minute that you flip that switch, it should activate within the chart itself. So these hide values and colorblind friendly color buttons that we once had, we've now updated to be toggle switches. And you'll note too that I also included an on and an off in the language itself. Not only do they have labels, but then they also tell you what is, when it's on versus when it's off. And this is again, just to help the accessibility, giving an extra way of perceiving that information. And forms. Forms, it's very crucial to have labels on, and I cannot stress this enough. All forms need to have labels. So one of the things that I was able to first do was cut out all of the form variations that we had that did not include labels within our design system. And as I had mentioned earlier too, if you are designing for a page that is using a language like English that reads from left to right, so should your form elements. They should also read from left to right. That is, of course, if if you're designing for a page that like Arabic that reads from right to left, you're going to want to also mimic that. And so you're going to basically mirror everything on the page. And you also want to make sure that you're avoiding having too much space in between the form labels and that you're grouping all of the related content together. So again, back to the various different types of disabilities, if somebody has low vision, they may be using a screen magnifier. And so imagine zooming into just this particular part of that screen. Let's say it was a checkbox and you have one checkbox or the check all the way to the left and then the label all the way to the right. If I'm zoomed into that area of the screen, I'm not going to see that label because it is too far away. There's too much spacing. So you want to make sure that all of your elements are related to one another. And so just here's another little update about things that we've updated and changed to make our product accessible. And so in this example here, I have our before chart. Located on this chart is an area chart that is in a very pale light yellow. Back to the fact that accessibility really does benefit all people. I got the wonderful opportunity of being able to travel a little bit and to be able to see how we are pitching our products to actual teachers. And as they presented this screen on the projector, everything disappeared because that yellow was so light and wasn't matching the color contrast ratio. So clearly that was the first thing that I took a look at, was what color in our color palette can we replace this with so that we are matching, or that we are meeting that color contrast. And then beyond that, in our legend here, we have two colors, both in circles. But one is representative of the line and the other one is representative of the area chart. So again, talking back to people who have who are colorblind, or if you're printing out this chart in black and white, I'm not going to know the difference between what this label should be and that, or which item that label applies to versus the other one. So another update that we made was making sure that that line was represented as a line in our legend, so that it's very clear that even if you turn this chart into black and white, that it's still very clear which element applies to which. Another thing that we did, focusing on our reading order, we realized that the reading order had our filters on the coming prior to our chart. Well, the more that we discussed it and the more that we thought about it, it actually made sense to have the filters come prior to seeing the chart, since they were affecting the chart. And so we wanted to update the visual to reflect that. So we moved our filters from the right over to the left. So in this way, someone who's coming in and who's using a screen reader is going to experience this in the same way that someone who is sighted, that they're going to take a look at this and they're going to look at the filters on the left first, then the area chart. We also made some updates in our language itself to kind of bold what it is that we are comparing it to, and then updating the text so that it is all gray, and gray was our color, our appropriate color contrast. And not only that, but then we also took a deeper dive into the third-party system that we were using for our charts and realized that they had the ability to export a CSV of the chart, a PDF, or to even view the data table itself. And so we made sure that we enabled that within our product as well. And the important part of that is that if a user is coming in here and is able to perceive the information better in a data table, they now have that option. Or if they want to download it as a CSV and then open it up in Excel, they now have different ways of interacting with the data. And so this just improves the accessibility, but then also the usability of this product. And so the final outcome of this particular project was that we now have a VPAT to self-report that our product, this particular product, is AA compliant, which is amazing. And if you'd like to learn more about a VPAT, I do have a link here just to explain what that is, but it's basically a self-report that you do on the accessibility of a product. And so another saying that we say at Panorama is progress over perfection. So accessibility isn't an overnight, it's not a one and done. And as I had mentioned earlier, it's not something only one person can do. And so something that's very important is creating accessibility as a culture itself. So something that we're working on at Panorama is creating ERGs around this. And so currently we have affinity groups started for disability allies, mental health awareness, and neurodivergent. And we plan on turning those into ERGs in the future. We are also working on bringing accessibility awareness even from onboarding. So creating a presentation so that new joiners know our value in accessibility and how important it is, and giving a high level as to what that means. And then also including training for all employees. And we're hoping to get nuanced and create training for specific fields as well. We want to be able to teach our designers to be better advocates of accessibility and teach our engineers to be better for the things that matter most to them. And accessibility is not an afterthought. It's really important that accessibility is thought throughout an entire project, brought in from the beginning, the middle, and the end. It's really crucial that it is constantly applied. As I had mentioned, trying to do it at the very end, that could be incredibly costly. And if you're working on a design and that design could have been improved from the very beginning, but then now you've started to work on it, you've started to code it, you've spent a lot of time and effort on one particular design, and then if you find out it's inaccessible at the end, then you've wasted all of that time, and that is also money. So if you're talking about accessibility from the very beginning of a project and you're building it into those, into your project itself, then you're talking and you're discussing about all of those things, and you're not wasting efforts on designs that are inaccessible. And another thing that's really crucial is building empathy and awareness. One thing that I strive to do is just to empower all of our team members to improve their accessibility and how inclusive they are. One really amazing team member has already pulled together a document on how to be more accessible in their meetings. And so how their presentations can be more accessible, and including things like color contrast and which of our colors in our color palettes can be used for text and which ones cannot. Emails can also be improved. Our social media posts, including closed captions and transcripts in all of your Zoom meetings, is fantastic for somebody who's neurodivergent like myself. The ADHD, I can get distracted quite easily, but when I have closed captioning included, it helps me to focus in on something. And then if I do get distracted, I can easily pick up where I left off because there's a transcript telling me what the text was. And so my overall point here is that accessibility is good user experience. And so now into our resources. I know that accessibility can be a little overwhelming when you're first starting off. So I've included in here just a quick review of how to review your product for accessibility. And so starting off, to make sure that everything that in your site can be accessed via keyboard. This is everything that is interactive, that it's responsive, that there's proper color contrast, that all of your form labels have labels, and the alternative text is included in your pictures as well. Now, I do want to note that if it is decorative pictures, they can be marked as decorative and then therefore do not need to have alternative text. I do have some really great resources specific to designers. I do want to call out the Stark plugin that can be for Figma, Sketch, Adobe XD, and Chrome. Their CEO, Kat Noon, is amazing. So if you have a chance to ever see anything that she speaks in or follow her, she's really fantastic. Another one of my favorites are these Alleycast videos by Rob Dodson. I send these to all of my engineers who are trying to learn more about accessibility because I feel like they're bite-sized information. and it's presented really well in a way that makes sense. I also recommend it for designers too, because I do find it to be helpful to have that same language to speak with engineers to say and understand the importance of accessibility. Testing is extremely crucial as well. So I do want to point out that you should ideally be testing with people who have disabilities. And there's an amazing company who has offered a product for that, and they're called Fable. It's a company I'm trying to get Panorama to start using as well. So I'm working on that pitch for us, because I'd really love to have an easy way to be able to test our product and our ideas and our concepts. And I should note too that Fable also is sponsoring a new podcast called Disability Bandwidth. I put this on there before I realized that the latest episode had one of my former coworkers on it. So their latest episode has Hector in it. So I got to catch up on that one earlier this morning. I was very excited. And then again, I know that it can be overwhelming when you're first joining or first starting to learn about the WCAG. So what I've done here is I've just included some of the top WCAG criteria that I tend to reference when I am going through the designs or updating our product. And before I go, I do want to say overlays are notoriously bad for accessibility. They do not include disabled people within the process, otherwise they would know that it is really problematic for the blind community. It does not work well with screen readers. In general, if you're looking for a company to partner with when it comes to accessibility, one thing I do want to note is that there should be people with disabilities on their leadership team. And if there are not, then they are not advocating on behalf of disabilities. So it's just something, a really quick note that that's an easy way to determine if a company is doing it right, because they should be speaking to the users that matter. And Accessibility in particular is one company who does offer overlays, and I just want to call them out. Do not use them because they have been sued a multitude of times by the blind communities. All right, so I'm at the end of my presentation. I will stop sharing and I'm ready for questions.
All right, thank you so much, Nikki. That was really fantastic. And I know I'm personally feeling very inspired now. I just really appreciate, again, just how thorough you were with all of it, starting off for people who are maybe new to accessibility. So starting off with just understanding why it's important. But I think especially the fact that you were able to call out what we can do as designers, what specifically we can work on. I think I saw a note in our Fig Jam from Cindy that mentioned, hey, I love that you're going through specific elements within the design system and how to improve each. So I think a lot of people are finding this very valuable. So I do, with our time left over, there's a couple of things that I'd like for us to tackle. So if anybody has any questions, I haven't seen any yet in the Fig Jam board, but if anybody does have anything they'd like to ask Nikki, you're welcome to drop it in the Fig Jam board, or if you'd actually like to come on and maybe ask Nikki yourself, you can feel free to use the raise hand reaction in Zoom, and you can kind of maybe call on some folks. So actually looks like we do have someone. So Reed, do you want to go ahead and come on in and ask a question?
Sure. I just want to say I thoroughly enjoyed this presentation and the way that you brought it forward using Figma. I've tried things similar to this with Google, and I love visually interactive things that give folks voice, but I do wonder about accessibility practices when we're doing that. If there's any live interactive visual content that we're sharing, how do we work with blind or visually impaired students around that kind of content? It's a question I'm trying to grapple with and I don't know the answer to.
Yeah, one thing I did not note in my presentation, but the more ways that you can provide information in general, the better. So if you have, especially when you're thinking about like alternative text, that applies to more than just a photo. If you are, if you're doing a presentation, enable closed captionings. speaking of, we have closed captionings enabled for this particular Zoom, enable transcripts that, and it's not just, again, not just for people who rely on it and who need it, but very important for somebody who maybe wants to catch up and see something, you know, really quickly, just wants to scan through what was done in the presentation. It just helps. So any ways that you can provide a multitude of ways of processing information, and if there are visuals on screen, and if it is something that you are speaking to, be very clear about describing what it is that you are looking at, and try to not use you know, images alone to like to dictate where you're looking. So you want to be sure that you're just being as descriptive as possible. How would you describe that to somebody who's on the phone with you? Is an easy way that I try to think about it. It's the same way that I kind of think through my presentations, and when I think through how I'm determining what the alt text should be on an image, is the way that I kind of think through is how would, if I was on the phone with somebody, how would I describe that particular element to them? And that helps me to write the alt text. And it just, so as many different ways that you can provide different ways of processing information, the better, because not only just for people who, you know, if it's visually impaired, but then also hearing impaired, you just want to consider that there's a multitude of different disabilities out there, and sometimes they kind of play against one another too. Like I said, with ADHD, I can see, I can hear, I don't have any disabilities there, but my brain processes information differently. So for me, it's best for me to see and to hear at the same time, which is again why I like to have closed captionings on.
All those points were extremely helpful. And a question for the future, like we're going to see more visually interactive tools during live Zooms, for example. But even within classrooms where we see that we encourage students to co-contribute on a shared canvas, do you think that in the future we'll be seeing accommodation requests coming forward for live interpreters in asynchronous classes, where, you know, to help navigate what other students have posted to a shared space?
I could say my opinion. I would love it if they did.
That's
think
great.
that
I
would be
agree with you.
amazing.
Okay.
All right, thank you so much for your question, Reed. It looks like Gregor has a question as well.
Yes, thanks. First of all, thanks for the presentation, Nikki. Really insightful, really helpful. And so as you were mentioning, like starting with accessibility is really overwhelming. And like I'm a product manager of a small EdTech startup from Austria, and we're currently coming to the US, and apparently in the US, it's like accessibility is a way bigger issue and like a topic which we have to work on. So we're just starting, and I'm a little bit like overwhelmed because actually we have 4 different types of product. We have like a hardware, we have an app, we have a website, and we have content. So I'm wondering, okay, so what's actually, where should we focus on first? And what would be the biggest?
Yeah, it's a
thing?
great question, and it's going to be individualized. It's going to be unique for everybody, right? So where questions that we would ask are, where are the majority of your users? Are the majority of your users in one particular product? Maybe that's the area that you want to focus in on, because that's where the majority of the users are going to be. So maybe you work on that one particular product and then kind of work your way out. Or maybe you work on the individual components, like I was talking about with the design system. Or maybe it's about starting with colors. And then so you just start with making sure that you have an accessible color palette to work with. And then maybe your first step is just updating the text across the board on all of your different products. So like I said, it's a very unique question, and it's going to be individualized between what the products you're working with, the type of accessibility issues that you have within your product too. As I had mentioned before, some of the things that we use to prioritize our accessibility efforts are, like, are we blocking any users from performing tasks, or being able to access content? If there's a hard block, then maybe that's where we focus our efforts on, and then start working on other areas. So I would recommend the kind of accessibility review page that I put in there. I'd recommend just kind of going through those steps on each of your products, taking a look at the different colors, and then being able to evaluate it from there. But again, think about your users as well, because you want to include that in the thought process.
That's a good point. Cool. Thanks a lot. Sounds good.
All right. Thank you so much for the question, Berger. I do want to be cognizant of time and just be respectful of everyone's time. I know it is a Friday. We do still have a lot of great questions that have been asked in the chat. So I think if this sounds good to everybody, we'll probably port those questions over into the FigJam board, and then Nikki will take some time to maybe review those and leave some answers, just so that for folks who didn't get their question answered, they'll still be able to get those answers that they need. But with the time that we do have left, I would love to encourage you all in the FigJam board at the very end. We have another question that just asks, what's your key takeaway from this presentation? We just love to hear kind of what you got out of this. What did you enjoy the most? Because that's really helpful for our speakers and for our team to kind of hear. If you enjoyed this chat, please consider joining us in our Slack channel. We will be having more events. We are hoping to have a speaker event probably once a quarter. And so our next chat will actually be targeted around teachers who have transitioned out of teaching into perhaps product design roles, product manager roles. So maybe for those of you who are a little bit newer and are exploring different options yourselves, that might be an interesting chat for you all. But yeah, Alicia, is there anything else you'd like to add to that before we wrap up?
Sounds great. And I'll just reiterate, if you want to give Nikki kudos in the FigJam towards the bottom, just give her some kudos and any lingering questions. And again, we'll learn from it too. We're going to keep iterating, right, on our events. This is our first one. So just really happy to see all your faces and to see the questions, see the interactions in FigJam. So thank you so much. Thank you, Nikki, so much for your thorough presentation and thorough preparation for this. Again, the slides are on the board and it's packed full of links and resources. So just really, really grateful for that. So thank you so much. I think that's it. You'll see if you follow us, we'll post the video and the recording sometime early next week. So thank you everyone. We'll see you soon. Thank you.